under consideration. The bills will be taken up in the order posted outside the hearing room. This list will be updated after each hearing to identify which bill is currently being heard by the committee. The committee will pause between each bill to allow time for the public to move in and out of the hearing room. We request that you wear a face covering while in the hearing room. Testifiers may remove their face covering during testimony to assist the committee and transcribers with clearly hearing and understanding the testimony. Pages will be sanitizing the front table and chair in between testifiers. When public hearings reach seating capacity or near capacity, the entrance will be monitored by a sergeant-at-arms who will allow people to enter the hearing room based upon seating availability. Persons waiting to enter a hearing room are asked to observe social distancing and wear a face covering while waiting in the hallway or outside the building. The legislature does not have the availability this year of an overflow room for those hearings which may attract many observers and testifiers. For hearings with large attendance, we request only testifiers enter the hearing room. We also ask that you please limit or eliminate handouts. Due to COVID concerns, we're providing two options this year for testifying at a committee hearing. First, you may drop off written testimony prior to the hearing. Please note that 4 requirements must be met to qualify to be on the committee statement. 1, submission of written testimony will only be accepted the day of the hearing between 8:30 and 9:30 here in the Judiciary Committee hearing room. Second, individuals must present the written testimony in person and fill out a testifier sheet. 3, testifiers must submit at least 12 copies. And 4, testimony must be a written statement no more than 2 pages single-spaced or 4 pages double-spaced in length. No additional handouts or letters from others may be included. This written testimony will be handed out to each member of the committee during the hearing and will be scanned into the official hearing transcript if all 4 of these requirements are met. As always, persons attending a public hearing will have an opportunity to give verbal testimony. On the table inside the doors, you will find yellow testifier sheets. Fill out a yellow testifier sheet only if you are actually testifying before the committee. And please make sure that if you fill the yellow sheet out, you fill it out legibly. Hand the yellow testifier sheet to the page as you come forward. There's also a white sheet on that same table if you do not wish to testify, but would like to record your position on a bill. This sheet will be included as an exhibit in the official hearing record. If you are not testifying or submitting written testimony in person and would like to submit a position letter for the official record, all committees have a deadline of 12 noon, the last workday before the hearing. Position letters will only be accepted by way of the Judiciary Committee's email address, which is posted on the legislature's website, or if they are delivered to my office prior to the deadline. Keep in mind that you may submit a letter for the record or testify at a hearing, but not both. Position letters will be included in the hearing record as exhibits. We will begin each bill hearing today with the introducer's opening statement, followed by proponents of the bill and opponents, and finally by anyone speaking in the neutral capacity. We will finish with a closing statement by the introducer if they wish to give one. We ask that you begin your testimony by giving us your first and last name and spell them for the record. If you have copies of your testimony, please bring up at least 12 copies and give them to the page. If you are submitting testimony on someone else's behalf, you may submit it for the record, but you will not be allowed to read it. We will be using a 3-minute light system. When you begin your testimony, the light on the table will turn green. The yellow light is your 1-minute warning, and when the red light comes on, we ask that you wrap up your final thought and stop. As a matter of committee policy, I'd like to remind everyone the use of cell phones and other electronic devices is not permitted during public hearings, though you may see senators use them to take notes or stay in contact with staff. At this time, we'd ask everyone to look at their cell phone and make sure it's in the silent mode. Just a reminder, verbal outbursts and applause are not permitted in the hearing room. Since we have gone paperless this year, the Judiciary Committee members will instead be using their laptops to pull up documents and follow along with each bill. Finally, you may notice committee members coming and going. That has nothing to do with how they regard the importance of the bill under consideration, but senators may have bills to introduce in other committees or other hearings to attend to. And with that, we'll have committee members introduce themselves, beginning with Senator Brandt.
Good afternoon. I'm Senator Tom Brandt, Legislative District 32, Fillmore, Thayer, Jefferson, Saline, and southwestern Lancaster County.
Good afternoon, Terrell McKinney, District 11, North Omaha.
Good afternoon, Suzanne Geis, District 25, the east side of Lincoln and Lancaster County.
Senator Pansing Brooks, our vice chair, is currently quarantined at home as a result of a COVID exposure. She will be participating by watching this on NET and then sending me questions if she has any for any of the witnesses or testifiers. Assisting the committee today are Lori Volertson, our committee clerk, and Josh Henningsen, one of our two legal counsel. And our pages today are Ashton Krebs and Kennedy Zuroff, both students at UNL. And with that, we'll take up our first bill of the afternoon, which is LB 111. Oh, there you are. I saw Friesen sitting over there, and I didn't see you. So. Oh, does it? Is it different than this? Oh no, you're up first. Perfect. Senator Albright, welcome to the Judiciary Committee.
Thank you. I do have a few things. Okay. Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop, members of the Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name's Joni Albright, J-O-N-I, Albright, A-L-B-R-E-C-H-T, and I represent the Legislative District 17 in Northeast Nebraska, which includes Wayne, Thurston, and Dakota counties. I'm pleased to be here today to introduce LB 111. As an initial matter, I'd like to offer you section by section. I just passed it out. I think we might have sent it to you, but just in case you have any questions, that explains various parts of the bill. Beginning back in late May of 2020 and stretching throughout the past summer, I was disturbed by peaceful protests that turned into violent riots, by vandalism and property damage, and by injuries sustained by men and women serving to protect our communities. I was not alone in my concerns, of course. I've talked about these events with other senators, constituents, business owners, and law enforcement, judges, and county attorneys throughout the state. I started discussions towards this bill in my own district in Northeast Nebraska. There I met and visited with not only local law enforcement, but also with members of law enforcement that were called in to help protect the good people of Lincoln on May 30th, 2020. I cannot state strongly enough the respect and admiration I hold for those who serve us in this capacity. These outstanding men and women put each of their lives on the line every day to keep you and I, our families, friends, and our community safe. I felt heartsick hearing the stories about liquid gasoline and fireworks being thrown at our first responders, blinding laser lights directed in their eyes and shots being fired at them and into public buildings that they were called to protect. They deserve better than this. Also disturbing are the reports that people from other states have incited violence and riots in Nebraska, and outside groups have offered to post bail for those put in jail for their actions against our cities and the police. This is simply not acceptable, and we must make this type of behavior as unattractive as possible to people from other states that might want to come to Nebraska and encourage crime. This bill sets out in part to do just that. Under this bill, LB 111, rioting is defined. It's inciting, recruiting for, or participating in a riot is punishable by offense. Interrupting services, meetings, blocking public roads, or destroying government property are likewise addressed. Graffiti of government buildings is discouraged through higher penalties than other graffiti crimes, and most importantly, assault on our first responders, whether fists or with harmful liquids, with laser pointers rightfully triggered stiffer penalties for offenders. If we expect our first responders to protect our persons and property, we must give them the tools to keep themselves safer as well. We must provide law enforcement and county attorneys the tools that hopefully discourage and deter, but certainly appropriately punish outside or other violent interests from causing harm. I've also received a request from various organizations asking me to add other first responders, for example, county correction officers, to the list of those who are protected by this bill. I think it would be beneficial for the members of the Judiciary Committee to consider any additional groups they feel might benefit from the bill. As lawmakers, it's our role to provide tools to keep our communities safe. That means our children, our adults, our teachers, our business owners, and yes, our law enforcement and other first responders. Thank you for listening, and I respectfully ask you to advance the bill out of committee and onto the floor of the legislature.
Okay. Any questions for Senator Albright? Senator McKinney.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony, Senator Albright. Over the summer, I had the opportunity to experience what was going on in our communities firsthand. And I'm not going to say everyone that attended a protest or a rally had the best intentions, but also was able to witness those individuals being agitated by law enforcement. I was tear gassed as well. So I think when we think about legislation like this, I think we got to take into account both sides. Not everybody's perfect on either side, but things like this sort of begin to infringe on, freedom of speech and the right to protest and things like that. Do you think there's a better compromise?
A better compromise I'm all in on a peaceful protest, but whether somebody should agitate a group or not, knowingly and willingly hurting someone else or destroying other people's property, we do need to have something. We have nothing in state statutes that I can find that help this. So again, I think we also are working on bills, if I'm not mistaken, that are trying to train law enforcement in situations like this. If this is going to be the new norm, we have to have something on both sides, that we're taking care of our first responders, our law enforcement, our firefighters, even going as far as, in hospitals. If people get accosted there or what, I'm just saying, when you insinuate that you're going to peacefully protest is one thing, but I don't see that we have to have something on both ends. Yes, I would agree with you there. But if you had a building like they did in Lincoln that was burnt down and $10 million worth of damage, I don't know that a police officer pushed somebody to do that. That was a choice somebody made. Now, if you're talking about, when riots get out of hand, there still has to be something, or we're not going to have any law enforcement either.
Yeah. My response to that is that, no, I don't think it'll be the new normal, but what has been the normal for this country since its inception is black men and women being killed at the hands of police. And that's what sparked these protests. I just feel like there's more of an effort to just protect law enforcement than there is to make sure that another black man or woman isn't killed by police. And that's the problem. I don't think this is needed if we ensure that black men and women and other individuals of color are not being brutalized and murdered by law enforcement. Thank you.
And I appreciate that comment. I absolutely do. Thank you.
So I have a question about your intent with this bill, Senator Albright, and it may be whether we talk about the insurrection in Washington, D.C., or the protests that we saw this summer. Your bill is in response to that, and it refers to, in I think sections 12 and 13, to rioting or participating in a riot. So you have 1,000 people protesting. It can be protesting whatever they're protesting.
Right.
6 of them start throwing stuff through the front windows of a building, or 6 of them go into the Capitol, break into the Capitol, but there's 94 of them that aren't doing anything but standing around. Who are we going to capture in your definition of participating in a riot? Because
The 6.
it started out.
The 6. You're going to have everybody around you, but if a law enforcement officer is the one that says, they saw you do it, or the other officer saw somebody throw something at the other officer, those are the ones you're taking in. I'm not taking in 900 people. I'm taking in the 6 that supposedly the law enforcement saw.
So your aim is simply to go after the people who are engaging in conduct,
Yes.
Unlawful conduct.
Yes.
So are your penalties, do they mirror, let's say we have a protest and somebody throws a rock through a windshield or through the front window of a retail store. Let's say 6 people do it so that we fall into your definition. Aren't those people already committing an offense that's punishable for engaging in that conduct?
Yes, but again...
What are we getting out of the riot piece, I guess?
Well, I think it's more importantly is to think that people could come into our cities, do what they did right here in Lincoln, around the Capitol, and they get taken in, and the mayors ask for them to be released. You have to have some kind of action, to be followed up with when you get taken in for breaking a window or hurting someone. You don't just go in and say, okay, they were rioting and we brought them all in, but hey, just let them go away. I don't think that's appropriate, because it's like your kids at home. If they're going to do something wrong, you better know what kind of punishment they're going to have to take your electronics away from you or do whatever you want to do, but there's got to be some kind of punishment, not just it's okay to do that. And I'm not, this wasn't something that I made up. I took it out of Tennessee. It passed in both of their houses immediately when these riots were starting. It has nothing to, whether things happened in Washington or not, I'm looking at the state of Nebraska and what we can be doing for this to help our law enforcement and our courts know what they need to do. And your attorney, I'm not.
No, and I'm not trying to trap you in anything. I'm just trying to understand if we're not going to pick up the people that didn't throw the rock through the windshield or through the store window. We're going to pick up the person that threw the rock through the window. Don't we already have offenses for that person?
And maybe
destruction of property and so forth.
And maybe we do. I don't know. That's for you all to decide if it's not needed.
Okay. That's all the questions I had after your introduction, but I'm sure we'll have a good bit of testimony.
I certainly hope so.
We'll look forward to that. I assume you'll be here to close.
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Senator Albright. We will now take proponents of LB 111. How many people are here to testify on this bill? If you could hold your hands up while I count. 3, 4, 5. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Senator Lathrop, members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Brad Johnson, spelled B-R-A-D-J-O-H-N-S-O-N. I'm the director of the Lancaster County Department of Corrections. I'm here to testify on behalf of our county board and my department in favor of LB 111. In particular, I support Senator Albright's willingness to include staff of my county correctional departments, of county correctional departments within the definition of public safety officer for purposes of this statute. Currently, these statutes exclude members of my department. For example, inmates who assault my staff must be charged with assault by a confined person. Although both of the offenses are Class 3A felonies. I believe the charge or conviction of an assault on a peace officer is more descriptive and appropriate in these cases. Assaultive behavior of any kind within a correctional facility is dangerous and unacceptable. An assault against a staff member is of the most concern regarding institutional good order. When an inmate is willing to use violence against a staff member, the safety and security of the entire facility is at risk. This is why the distinction between assault on a peace officer and assault by a confined person is particularly important during the classification and housing process. As we review prior criminal and assaultive behavior, it would be beneficial to understand what type of assault is being reflected in the criminal history. It is also important to me and my staff that we be recognized as members of the peace officer profession. We are all community servants who work in challenging environments and situations. I believe the tendency to leave county correctional staff out of these statutes and bills isn't done intentionally. However, our service is essential to the criminal justice system, and I feel the inclusion of my staff and others across the state would help to solidify that recognition. Thank you for your time, and I can answer any questions.
Okay. Any questions? Senator Geist.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Johnson. Thank you for being here. So I just want to clarify that your agreement with this bill is in its definition of peace officer or correctional officer. Is that correct?
It includes county correctional officers into the definition of peace officer. And yes, that's, my board hasn't taken a position necessarily on the rest of the bill, and not that I'm aware of, but
Okay.
I wanted to come and express agreement with
That definition?
Yes.
Could I ask you about that? And assaults that take place at the county correctional center? And could you give us an idea of how frequently that happens?
We don't have, 2020 was a kind of an odd year. I think those have increased fairly significantly this last year. As a rule, at least in my facility, inmate on staff assaults aren't terribly common. Maybe 2 a month.
Okay. And one last question.
Sure.
Degree of severity. I know, of course, it varies, but typically, do you have a typical degree, and then the outliers are either one or the other?
Typically they're, getting punched. We recently had somebody who was getting choked. We had one a while back where they were trying to gouge an officer's eye out. But as a rule, it's usually bumps and bruises or injured joints.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for your testimony.
Senator Kinney.
Thank you. I'm reading the statement of intent of this bill, which says the purpose of LB 111 is to define and enact criminal violations relating to rioting, aggressive rioting, inciting riots, looting, assault on first responders, to prescribe penalties including but not limited to minimum sentencing, fines, and restitution. What I'm having trouble with is, where does correctional officers fit into this intent of this?
I think there's portions of the bill where it talks about officers being assaulted even during riots in a facility, or I think there's other sections with the vandalism on personal property and so forth. I'm be perfectly honest, honed in on the definition of peace officer, where it lists state correctional officers and law enforcement folks, and we were absent from that list.
What's the current penalty for assaulting an officer in your facility?
Actually, the penalties are the same at this point. Assault by a confined person is a felony 3A offense, and under this bill, assault on a peace officer would be a felony 3A offense.
So what's the purpose of this bill if it's already in place?
primary interest is to be able to charge individuals who assault my staff with assault on a peace officer.
But they already can be charged with the same offense, right?
They're charged with assault by a confined person, yes.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Mr. Johnson, I don't see any more. Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
You testified a couple of years ago on how long people sit at the Department of Corrections in Lancaster County waiting to have a mental health evaluation for those, or waiting to get mental health treatment for competency.
True.
You were in front of this committee with that, and I think you testified that the average wait was 100 days, and Senator Hansen passed a bill on restoring competency. Has that number gone down?
It has gone down. It's closer. We've cut it in half, I'd say. We're around the 50-day mark, so it has trended down over the years because of various efforts that have been taken.
That's certainly an improvement.
Yes,
Still
it is.
concerning that people would be confined, incompetent, mentally incompetent to sit through a trial and be sitting 50 days in your Department of Corrections.
It's still frustrating, and I'll burn my saddle, for lack of a better word, but I think we continue to work on trying to make.
No, I could tell you care deeply about the topic, and I appreciate your efforts in that regard and for sharing giving me an update.
Sure.
So I appreciate that. Thank you, and thanks for being here today.
All right. Thank you.
We will take the next proponent. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
You may proceed.
My name is Robin Calcara. I'm presently a Lincoln Police and Fire Chaplain. I'm also a
Mr.
full-time
Cal-
volunteer chaplain. I'm
Can you
sorry.
Spell your name for us.
Okay, I'm sorry. Calcara.
You can go ahead.
Okay. I am also a full-time volunteer chaplain in the Nebraska Department of Corrections, currently working with Nebraska State Penitentiary. What this means is that I have a privilege of rubbing elbows with a lot of public servants through my service, everywhere from police, fire, sheriffs, and the correctional officers in the Department of Corrections. A lot of selfless people indeed. We live in a world of insanity. If 2020 taught us anything, it taught us that. Our world is turned upside down. I remember last year hearing things like defund the police headlines of misuse of power, and I had to ask myself, are 99% of the police the problem? These are men and women who have chosen a career to protect and serve our great citizens of Nebraska. It is thought that across the gamut of public service that we are short of qualified, willing people by about 20% on a national scale. Early retirement was issued in various cities amongst police and record numbers in 2020. The uptake here is measuring risk, pay, longevity, and good professionals choose a different path. It's just not worth it. Yet we are needing close to 20% more in order to keep our people safe. As I read this bill, I was astounded at the small amount of protection that is in place regarding our public servants. I read the entire bill, and as I read it, I was continually asking myself, you mean that's not a law already? It's not illegal to throw body fluids in the face of our police, or is it okay to trash and paint vulgar slang on our public servants' houses with only a slap on the wrist as punishment? Is it really? This bill is all about pro-social behavior. Never in my lifetime have we needed to spell what the golden rule is than more than today. And lastly, maybe even more significantly, my friend Andy Taylor showed me this at a young age. that when you wear a badge, even though you're just one man, that you represent all the people of your town or city. What this means is they represent the citizens of our cities and state, and the power they wield is the wishes of our people. It's important for them to know that we have their back and that antisocial behavior and hateful demonstrating are not okay, and that we stand with them for their well-being. Thank you for considering this.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Calcara. I do not see any questions for you today, but thanks for coming down.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Loving the weather outside. Little change from last week. My name is Amber Parker, A-M-B-E-R, last name Parker, P-A-R-K-E-R. I first want to start out reading just the statement of intent from Senator Albright's office. It says the following constitutes the reasons for this bill and the purposes which are sought to be accomplished thereby. The purpose of LB 111 is to define and enact criminal violations related to rioting, aggressive rioting, inciting riots, looting, assault on first responders, to prescribe penalties including but not limited to minimum sentencing, fines, and restitution. I want to say that as a protester, I am a proponent to LB 111. I want to now read Amendment 1 from the Constitution of the United States of America and come back to Senator Albright's bill. Senator Lathrop, as you know, as an attorney, the governing law of the land, and every senator here representing us should know that too. So this is always good for us to have on hand. Amendment 1 of the Constitution of the United States of America. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Looting, burning buildings, throwing rocks through buildings, assaults on our first responders is not peaceably to assemble, nor peacefully in protest. So we know it's important that we all support protests. I myself have actually protested against a judge with a group of people. I saw an abuse of power within a courtroom. I saw the judge deny a motion for a child to continue to be in a dangerous situation when the parents were pleading. And anyhow, in saying that, I knew that as a concerned citizen, I could not sit back and watch this abuse of power. So I joined together with others and we created a protest. I just want to say there is a need in this state for LB 111. We need to set a precedent and be an example to the rest of the United States of America that those who are going to burn buildings, do harm to our first responders, and not disrespect. Freedom of speech is different than throwing bottles of urine, throwing Molotov cocktails at people. And I just have to say that sometimes the way things are shown is that there are certain people that are victims that actually were perpetrators. And I'm not saying that all across the board. There were many peaceful protesters, but there were a few that were not. And they destroyed people's livelihoods and even brought bloodshed to some streets in the United States of America.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for being here today. We appreciate you coming down.
Thank you.
Next proponent. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Senators. My name is Mark Bonkowitz, M-A-R-K-B-O-N-K-I-E-W-I-C-Z. I live at 111 29Z Street in Omaha, Nebraska, District 12. I'm here today in support of LB 111, the First Responder Protection Act. Here are my reasons for supporting this legislative bill. A, during the summer of 2020, Americans witnessed unlawful mobs destroying private and public property, assaulting first responders, and killing first responders and innocent citizens. B, unfortunately, Omaha and Lincoln businesses suffered extensive damage and had the tragic loss of life during the summer of 2020. C, when you watch the video clips of the 2020 riots in major U.S. cities, the verbal assaults heaped upon police and other law enforcement officials were intense and shamefully delivered. D, in other video clips, the mobs demonstrating childish behavior prevented ambulances from being able to deliver wounded patients to hospitals for their needed treatment. LB 111 is an example of powerful legislation that will benefit all Nebraska citizens because it is well written and contains clearly defined and logical phrases such as Section 3, damage to property of government actors. Section 4, penalties for graffiti on government buildings. Section 5 clarifies the definition of first responders. Section 8 adds a mandatory fine for a third-degree assault crime. Section 16, obstructing a public way. Section 19 restates the penalty for multiple convictions under the Habitual Criminal Act. I urge you to vote LB 111 out of committee for floor debate, where it receives the scrutiny of questions and answers that rigorous floor debate can provide. Please waste no time passing LB 111 into law to maximize the safety of first responders and the security of all citizens. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks for your testimony. I do not see any questions at this time.
Thank you.
Any other proponents here to speak on in support of LB 111? Seeing none, we will take opposition testimony next. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Spike Eicholt, S-P-I-K-E-E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T, appearing on behalf of the ACLU of Nebraska and the Criminal Defense Attorneys Association in opposition to the bill. The bill's got several components, but I think that it could best be described as an anti-protest bill. The express purpose from the introducer and the proponents is this bill is in retaliation to some things that they witnessed happen in Nebraska and other parts of the country in response to the George Floyd homicide and as part of the Black Lives Movement protests. It's got various components to the bill that are problematic. One, it increases penalties in a variety of different ways. You heard, I think, Brad Johnson testify earlier, the part that he liked about the bill is that it classifies correctional officers as peace officers for purposes of various felonies. I just want to remind the committee, Mr. Johnson acknowledged that there's a number of felonies already that can be charged against people who are in jail and commit crimes. There's a crime called assault by a confined person, which is similar to the concept that Senator Brandt mentioned with the bus, where if you're in the jail and you assault anybody, another inmate, a staff person, a guard, an attorney during a visit, you are committing a felony assault by confined. There's a second-degree assault, felony assault, where if you are confined and you strike another person and you're confined in jail or prison, that's a 0 to 20. So that's already covered. It does increase penalties for graffiti, and I draw there's so many components of the bill, but I just want to draw one part to your attention. On page 5, lines 29 to 31, it makes it a Class 1 misdemeanor if somebody applies graffiti to a property belonging to a school. That could very easily capture children just at school getting caught up in a Class 1 misdemeanor. I don't think that's the intent of our bill, but as I said earlier today, the things that we talk about here are not going to be reflected in the statute books. This is going to be, if passed, on the books, and that will be a significant charge to charge somebody with just putting their name on something, a school book or a sidewalk or something like that. But the real heart of the bill, I think that's problematic, is the anti-riot provisions on pages 14 and 15. as Senator Lathrop intimated in his questioning, there's already existing felonies and already existing crimes to hold those people who damage property, who cause injury to people during a protest, or even not during a protest. There's ample crimes for it. And you've not heard from anybody in support of this bill that can demonstrate that they caught somebody that was involved in the May 30th thing and had to let them go, because there's nothing they could charge them with. There has been some difficulty in identifying the people involved, but that's not something the bill can address. But if you look at the definition of riot, it means any disturbance, and if you look down maybe on page 14, line 23, and that riot results in serious bodily injury to one or more persons or in property damage of at least $5,000, it's a felony. In other words, if you are there present at a riot, somebody else causes it, someone else causes the injury or damage, you're still subject to the penalty for merely being present. And it can happen to innocent people who are there, not even actually part of the riot. Remember when we had the Ernest Jackson bill, that one anti-mask woman testified that she got interested in Ernest Jackson because she saw some people at a BLM riot, and she found out about it, or a BLM protest, I should say. But imagine that things during that sort of exchange of ideas had turned south, she would be subject to prosecution under this bill as written. And I urge the committee not to adopt the bill.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Eichel? Senator Geist.
Yes, so I'm curious if there are penalties here that don't exist in other places in statute, or are you saying they all do?
I'd say they already do.
All of them?
I have to go back and look at corresponding. I mean, you can't deface someone else's property. That I know. I'm enough of a lawyer to know that you can't break someone else's car window or house window and say there's nothing you can do. This bill identifies the types of private property involved that belongs to a government, belongs to a school, belongs to a government official or something like that, and makes an increased penalty. So that's one thing the bill does do differently.
So it spells out where maybe existing law does not list
Right.
a specific location.
Right. It starts down that trend that Senator McDonald's bill kind of picks up on earlier, where we start identifying victims and classifying them based on profession. This identifies victims of graffiti and criminal mischief and classifies them according to their profession or who owns or what entity owns the property.
Okay. But you would still say that the majority of this is already covered in existing law?
Yes.
Is that correct?
I mean, they had the update. Chris Dunker did something in Journal Star sort of updating the cases that they picked up regarding the incident that happened on May 30th in Lincoln Police. And they identified a number of cases that they have prosecuted, that they've been able to identify people. The guy who was at the Quick Shop, for instance, got a series of felony charges. I think they were able to identify some people that were involved in nefarious activities there at the city-county building. I understand that it's frustrating for people to watch TV and see these things happening. But throwing a bunch of felonies on the books are not necessarily going to aid in the prosecution of wrongdoers who do those things.
Okay, thank you.
Senator DeBoer.
I have a specific question about page 15, section 15, line 10. A person shall not, with the intent to prevent or disrupt a lawful meeting, procession, or gathering, substantially obstruct or interfere with the meeting, procession, or gathering by physical or verbal utterance. Is that one going to have constitutional problems with free speech? Because if I'm yelling during a meeting or something, there might be something there. Is that one strikes me as that one might have some constitution. Can you answer whether you think that might have constitution?
I think it certainly does, because first you are talking about a lawful meeting or gathering. You're talking about, in all probability, kind of like what we had happen this morning where somebody from the audience volunteered an answer. I don't think that was necessarily done with the intent to prevent or disrupt, but it was an intentional act. There was something that happened at the Lincoln City Council meeting earlier this week where a number of people wanted to be heard and they were sort of ruled out of order. And I think that putting this in statute would give cover to government officials to do that against people. I think it is problematic from a First Amendment standpoint.
Okay, thank you.
So I want to ask some questions and talk about an accessory. So generally, for the benefit of the committee, talk about a person who agrees to drive somebody to the liquor store, and the passenger goes inside to rob the liquor store and shoot somebody. Who's getting charged with what in that circumstance?
In that situation, if the person who shot dies, the person who drove can be prosecuted under the felony murder doctrine and can get punished just as if they were the shooter.
Okay, so one of the things I'm struggling with when we talk about a riot, if we just say, and this isn't definitely in response to protests, so let's say that there are, and I'm just going to use the number 100 people walking through 72nd and Dodge Street, and 3 of them had the same color of sweatshirt on. They came down together, they're there to join the protest. One of the people wearing the same colored sweatshirt, they're together. One of them picks up a rock and throws it through a window. Are all 3 of them going to be found guilty of a riot because they came there together, but the 2 didn't know the one was going to pick up a rock? In other words, there's this idea that somehow if there are more than 3 or 6 people together and somebody does something, now those people are all not protesters anymore, they're all considered rioters. I mean, is that making the right to assemble and the right of free speech an element of a crime in this case?
Yes. You already have the existing aiding and abetting ability to prosecute somebody who assists or aids or helps someone either before or after the commission of a crime. And you can prosecute them if they drive the getaway car, or if it's like a riot or something like that, or a criminal mischief. If the person hands someone else a piece of concrete and that person throws it through the window, that's aiding and abetting the commission of that crime. And it can be prosecuted as if you were the principal offender. This bill would propose to sort of presume that your mere presence at something where someone or other people do something that is criminal, that you're somehow presumed to have been taken part in it. And that part that I read before, if the riot activity, or whatever you want to describe it as, results in bodily injury to somebody or damage, you're guilty of the crime. I think it's suspect constitutional. You have a right to protest. And that can't be thwarted by someone who just shows up and throws a rock. It can't be, government can't prohibit that First Amendment activity based on someone else's criminal act.
Isn't, as soon as you make it 3 or more people or 6 or more people at something and something bad happens, you've made the assembly, which is lawful, unless everybody has the same intent. You've made the fact that there's an assembly, even with just one bad actor, an element of the crime.
That's right. And since it's a felony, law enforcement can act preemptively on that. In other words, if they have reason to believe a felony is about ready to happen, they can react, they can arrest, they can detain, they can disperse, and they can thwart First Amendment activity.
This is a little bit, in some ways, like the bill we heard this morning for the bus drivers. The challenge is when there is a protest and there are not 100 people, but 5,000 people, and somebody throws a rock through the front of the business and a window's shattered, or a person goes in and steals retail stuff out of a business, it's hard to catch that person in the middle of that chaos. But that's not, the solution isn't to say, if it happens in a riot, then all of you are a part of a crime.
Right, that's right. And if I referenced that follow-up story that Dunker did for the Journal-Star, I mean, that's what Lincoln law enforcement have been doing for hours, is going through video trying to identify people. And really the bill doesn't address that. That's just a practical difficulty, unfortunately, in those situations.
Going further, or taking it one step further, when we had people on January 6th break into the United States Capitol, not all those people broke a window or had the same intent. Some people went in and rifled through offices, broke windows, broke doors, did whatever they did. There was clearly a lot of property damage. But not everybody who went through that front door was there to break anything.
Right.
Right? This bill would allow every single one of them to be prosecuted.
That's right, because as written, that damage that happened in the Capitol building was probably over $5,000. Who knows what Pelosi's podium was worth, right? So that's something that was damaged. And just being there as part of the riot, and that riot results in that damage or loss of life in that situation, they can be prosecuted.
And that really gets back to this point, which is people participate in these things with different intent. There may be somebody who is there to create problems and throw rocks and use spray paint to write on the side of a building or a monument. There's an awful lot of people there that just want to wave a flag and talk about how they believe the president still ought to be the president.
That's right. And by having this bill, you're allowing those provocateurs, or whatever you call them, those people who are on the other side of the equation, just to show up and start getting the crowd going, and then just slip off. And then everyone that's remaining there is on the hook.
Okay. Well, there's certainly some hazards in trying to lump everybody that shows up at one of these things where damage is done or somebody gets hurt, lumping them all together, and that's the challenge. Every single one of them could be prosecuted. Everybody that broke the law could be prosecuted for something, but it's really a challenge. I know with the activities or the insurrection or whatever you want to call it at the United States Capitol, they're looking at social media and identifying as many people doing discrete acts of damage or injury, right?
Right.
Okay. Did you have a question, Senator Geis?
I don't. I think you answered. Well, I'll go ahead. I'm just kind of trying to walk the line between when does criminal activity begin and when does peaceful protest end? And that's kind of what we're talking about. And so if you're given a lawful order to disperse and they don't, and then criminal activity occurs, are we talking then that everyone involved is then liable?
Under current law? Or
Yes, currently, and then put up next to this.
if it truly is a lawful order that's given to people and they refuse to comply with it, then there is a separate, it's a city misdemeanor, is also a state law, obstructing a peace officer or refusal to comply, that can be prosecuted now. The courts are not, curfews are always sort of suspect, but assuming you have a valid curfew or a valid time, place, manner restriction on a protest, that can be enforced under current law. And of course, anything that's clearly criminal, and I'm not talking about protesting and just not wanting to go home on time, but clearly criminal, damaging someone else's property, hurting people, those sorts of things, that is, you can prosecute that now under existing law.
Okay. Still struggling
To
with.
follow up on that question, though, if the law enforcement, let's have 1,000-person protest, and they're in the old market or down here by the courthouse, if law enforcement gives a lawful order to disperse, every one of those people could be prosecuted for violating a lawful order from a police officer,
Yes.
right? If one of those people happens to take a rock and throw it at a law enforcement officer and cause them to be blind in one eye, not everybody who didn't disperse is now guilty of a first-degree assault.
That's right.
Right?
That's exactly
and that's
right.
the challenge with trying to say, okay, it's a riot, so now we're going to throw the net over everybody like they were the driver on the car that went to the liquor store to rob it.
Okay, you articulated better what I was trying to say.
No, I understand what Senator Albright's trying to do, but it's very difficult when you make, my judgment, very difficult when you make the assembly part of an element of the crime, because you have a right to assemble, just as Ms. Parker read from the Constitution. You have a right to assemble, and we're looking for an easier way to do the law enforcement piece, which is the challenge in Washington, D.C., it's the challenge in Lincoln, it's the challenge in Omaha. Who are the rock throwers? All of them can be punished. It's just hard to find it. Or the rabble-rousers or whatever they are. But any other questions from the committee? I see none. Thanks for being here, Mr. Eichel. We appreciate your thoughts and insights. Anyone else here to testify in opposition to LB 111? Seeing none, Senator Albright. I thought I saw her wave. She's going to wave close. Okay, before we close the hearing, though, let the record reflect that on 111, we have position letters from 22 people. 20 are proponents, 2 are opponents, and we have 2 written testimony from 2 sources. Joe Cohout, on behalf of the United Cities of Sarpy County, is a proponent, and Jerry Stillmock is also a proponent for the Nebraska State Volunteer Association and the Nebraska Fire Chiefs Association. And with that, we'll close our hearing on 111, and that brings us to LB 104, Senator Friesen. Good afternoon.
Members of the Judiciary Committee, this is my first trip here, and I was just about into my food coma. Now I have to wake up.
This is exciting stuff for us.
It is. My name is Kurt Friesen, C-U-R-T-F-R-I-E-S-E-N, represent District 34, and appear to you today to introduce LB 104. LB 104 seeks to add language to the criminal mischief statute to provide that if one or more victims suffer financial loss as a result of one offense, those losses can be combined in order to determine the criminal offense and the resulting charges. There are other criminal statutes in Nebraska that use this aggregate language, including statutes relating to theft offenses, forgery, unauthorized use of a financial transaction device, including the aggregation of pecuniary loss in criminal mischief offenses would bring the law in line with these existing statutes. I've heard from prosecutors, one of which will be here today, that there are many instances where the property of multiple citizens is damaged as part of one continued act or course of conduct, but these instances cannot be charged in one single charge, which is what this bill would allow them to do. By adding the aggregation of pecuniary losses in the criminal mischief statute, prosecutors and courts would be able to work more efficiently with offenders, will be held accountable for damage to numerous victims that occurs as part of one offense, and will provide better access to the justice system for these victims. I ask the committee to move this bill forward, and happy to take any questions from the committee at this time. And again, there will be someone following me who will be able to answer the questions who's probably more qualified than me.
Okay, let me see if there are any questions. Anybody need to interrogate Senator Friesen? Senator DeBoer.
Senator Friesen, thank you for introducing this bill. My question is, and maybe this is something for someone else, but when you say one scheme or course of conduct, is there any sort of definition of what scheme or course of conduct is? For example, could I have one scheme that occurred over a period of many days?
I can't answer that, but from my understanding, it would be over a period of some hours, not multiple days or weeks. This is in a course of one act.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll ask someone who comes up behind you, and/or maybe we could make a definitional.
That would be good.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. I don't see any other questions for you, Senator Friesen. Are you going to stay to close?
I'll stay.
Okay, perfect. We will take proponents of LB 104. If you're here in support, you may come forward. How many people are here to, just so that we can alert Senator Kavanaugh, how many people are going to testify on this bill? Looks like 2. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Chairman, members of the Judiciary Committee, my name is Sarah Karstensen. I'm a Deputy County Attorney in Hall County and have been so for over 16 years.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's not very often to have that. Usually it's slow down.
Well, we may have you slow down too, but
Sure. My name is Sarah Karstensen, S-A-R-A-H. Karstensen is C-A-R-S-T-E-N-S-E-N. I'm a deputy county attorney for Hall County in Grand Island, and I'm here to testify in support of LB 104 on behalf of the Nebraska County Attorneys Association. I'm also a resident of Hamilton County in Senator Friesen's district and have been for over 15 years. I appreciate him bringing this bill forward on our behalf. The handout that I gave you, if you are interested, contains a number of these statutes that include references to aggregation, just by way of example. That way you can all kind of see how this fits into one scheme. And that's why I think that this bill should be moved forward, that it is part of a grander scheme. When we talk about theft offenses and such, there's this opportunity to aggregate. When it comes to criminal mischief, there isn't. So if you were to take several items from different people, you could aggregate those into one theft offense. But if you were to smash several people's phones, you'd have to charge them separately. So it's just a little bit of a difference, a little bit of a nuance, but it fits into a broader, kind of the broader scheme that we're already using with respect to other offenses. For prosecutors, resources, including our time, are very valuable, our staff time and our own time. We don't like to go forward with prosecutions where we have anywhere between 30 and 100 or more counts. I can give you an example of last year where we had some juveniles that damaged over 80 vehicles. We had 80 plus victims, and what they had done was just gone through smashing windows as they went down the road. And you think about the victims that are involved in these types of crimes. I don't know which one of you took for granted, or if any of you took for granted that when you got into your vehicle this morning that you were able to get here without having to first stop, contact a police officer, have that interruption, have to have your car taken somewhere to get fixed, couldn't get your kids to school, couldn't get to work on time, those kinds of things. But if you also think about the nature of the victims that we're often seeing with these types of crimes, they're the kind of folks that don't have the opportunity to put their car in an enclosed garage or something like that, whereas some of us have those opportunities. So when these folks do get hit in our community, they are hit in a way that is more damaging, more destructive to them. So that's part of why we're bringing this forward too, is those victims. The court is also a consideration for us as well, in the sense that it is time consuming for them to have to read through multiple charges. And so if we can condense that down, we can allow each victim to have that opportunity to have their crime considered. If we as prosecutors elect not to prosecute every single offense that we could, and we often don't because there's kind of a max benefit for the number of charges you charge in any particular case, we leave some of those victims out. And that leaves those victims sometimes feeling like justice isn't working for them, that they didn't get to have access to our system, and that their crime was not considered as one that was important enough, either by the county attorney that was filing those charges or by the court who didn't hear those charges. From my standpoint as being a prosecutor for over 16 years, this statute will allow prosecutors to more efficiently do their work, allow the courts to process cases more efficiently, hold offenders accountable for large-scale damages that occur when a series of crimes involving numerous victims are committed as a part of one scheme, and provide better access to justice, to the justice system for victims of crime. It also then promotes the legitimacy of the entire system within our community as a whole. I would ask for your support in passing through this bill.
okay. Senator DeVore.
So, I've already previewed my question for you. It seems like I looked briefly while you were talking, but obviously wasn't able to read in depth, that there is some case law on scheme or course of conduct. Is that correct?
There is some case law. I heard your question, and I don't have a great answer for you in this moment. Would it be helpful if I could communicate with you after the hearing, and I could send that to anyone?
Yeah, if you can send us a little bit about what scheme or course of conduct, because of course there's a big difference between in one night driving down a road, smashing all the windows, and smash a window one day, 3 weeks later smash a window.
Yeah, and that's, I would say in my experience, it's kind of awkward that this ended up right after the prior bill, because this was, I can assure you that nothing out of this bill was born out of those instances. This has been a problem in Grand Island. I've prosecuted a number of these cases. We continue to prosecute these cases where we have either kids smashing windows, or I can give you another example where an individual, an adult, broke into a facility that is a storage facility and went around smashing, damaging, getting into campers, RVs, boats, and such. But all of those were independent people. We couldn't aggregate that together. So those are the types of instances that we were looking at when reflecting on this, and we've been kicking this idea around for quite some time, knowing that there's this scheme where there's aggregation in these other similar types of crimes in our system, but not for this one specific set.
Yeah, if you could send me something on that, that would be great.
I will do that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Brandt?
Thank you, Chairman Lathrop. Thank you, Ms. Carsonson, for testifying today, and I'm not an attorney. So the aggregation of, they go down the street, 10 cars are vandalized, 10 different owners, each car is $500 damage, so now we've got $5,000 of damage. Is that what you're trying to achieve here?
Right, so instead of having 10 different counts for each of those individuals, we could aggregate that into one count and have one count that would include the value for all of that. And then we would list all those victims within that one count as victims.
And then you could also elevate that to a felony instead of a misdemeanor?
Potentially, yes. But in the same vein, if we chose to move forward with 80 or 100 counts of smaller misdemeanors, you're going to end up with the same kind of potential outcome or same kind of potential time frame, perhaps, if you have so many of those involved.
I would, and then that would give your office leverage when it came to charging?
I suppose it could. It's not the reason behind it. It's more or less in keeping it consistent with the other Nebraska laws that we have and giving us that opportunity when there is such a large number of damage occurring all through one course.
So your basic reason is more of efficiency through the whole system?
Efficiency and including victims in this. We've had situations where victims weren't necessarily included in the charges because it just isn't, it doesn't, there's a maximum net benefit you can get probably, in my experience. Whether you're convicted of 10 charges or 20 charges of something, typically courts don't do much more different in the outcome.
So if using my 10-car example, $500 each,
Sure.
it has to be $5,000 for a felony, and only 9 of the victims come forward, and I choose not to. Can you aggregate mine in even though I refuse to come forward?
So there's multiple layers to that. We could, I suppose, if we had information that I felt like as a prosecutor that I could use to obtain and sustain a conviction. If I felt like I could do that on enough evidence, even if the individual victim didn't come forward, if I felt like I had that type of evidence in front of me, I'm sure I could probably go forward with that, knowing I would have that type of evidence. But that's where I think some of that prosecutorial discretion comes in. And at least in my area where I've prosecuted, 16 plus years, that type of discretion goes into all of these cases. And there's multiple layers of reflection. It's not just the law enforcement officers who refer charges to us, and as county attorneys, we just automatically, whatever they said, that's not how it works. And it's especially not how it works where I prosecute. We look at each one of those and determine, is this something that I feel like, just because they were referred for prosecution or they were arrested, can I truly, on the evidence I have and the evidence that will be admissible, get a conviction in the first place and have that conviction stick beyond any kind of appeals. So I feel like there's multiple layers of discretion and those layers of review that go into that.
Okay, thank you. You've helped me understand the topic.
I don't see any. Well, let me see what Senator Pansy Brooks has. If you consolidate these, let's go back to the smashing the windshield. If you get enough broken windshields and you get to 5,000, we've taken whatever number of windshields that is, each of which would have been a misdemeanor, and now we're dealing with a felony, right?
Technically, yes. But
that's really the point of it, isn't it? So that you have the option to turn several misdemeanors into a felony because somebody's on some kind of a break the window spree.
I wouldn't say it's ever to truly turn it into a felony. That's not how I look at it, and that's not how I look at the proposed legislation. From our perspective, it's a matter of being able to prove that all in one kind of fell swoop, where there is this course of conduct. It's not like they were just kind of how Senator Moore was talking earlier. It's not separate events. It wasn't like something happened on this Monday, and then next Tuesday something happens, and then a random Thursday some time beyond. We're talking about one whole event. In the way that this particular criminal mischief law is structured, it's different than like our theft and other ones that are structured similar to aggregate it. It is to allow us to bring that all in together. And we'd still have to have that proof to put it together. It wouldn't be a matter of just the charge alone, and we still have to go into court and get a conviction, and even then we take into consideration what is that person's history, what goes into that. There is a number of things, a number of layers of protection along the way for each one of these steps. Just because a felony is charged, even in that instance, doesn't mean that they're going to be put in prison. And a number of these, especially in Hall County, are juveniles. So whether they get convicted of the most minor misdemeanor, disturbing the peace, or the most serious felony that you could put in front of them, the outcome is rehabilitation.
Well, you could get that with one misdemeanor, with one windshield.
We could. But that's part of the reason that bringing this forward is our victims are not seeing that side from, if we bring forward one count and 79 other people are standing there saying, what about my car? What about the fact that I didn't get to get my kids to school that day? What about the fact that I had to give up going to work that afternoon the next day to pick up my car from the car dealership or repair shop or whatever? And then when it comes to restitution, if we're talking about kids, how many of these folks do you really think are going to get restitution out of that? Is it satisfying to come in front of your legal system and feel left out? What do you do when you come in front of your legal system and your county prosecutor says, we're not going to go forward on yours because we have this other one that we like better?
Well, we do have a statute that lets victims of minors' vandalism collect from their parents.
But they'd have to go back into court and take that additional time. So it's just not satisfying. It doesn't feel like you're getting what you want out of your justice system when you could, at the very first blush, have a prosecutor bring in, say, and the examples I'm giving you are very real. Last year was 80. We've had several of these where we've had multiple counts. 10, it may be 10, but there are instances where it's much higher than that. And those are those instances where we end up having to pick and choose how we're going to move that forward from an efficiency standpoint.
Okay. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I don't see any other questions.
Does anybody else want me to pass that information on? Or
Send it to the committee and they'll disperse it. So if you send it.
Yeah, I am interested, though, I will tell you, because I think Senator DeBoer's got a point. If let's say that I'm a juvenile, we live alongside the highway, and Dad got me a pellet gun for Christmas, Now I'm going to shoot one car a day. One car a day. I'm going to knock a window out of one car a day, and you finally figure out who it is, and it's been a month, and I've hit 30 different cars, and that's my scheme. Every 4 o'clock every afternoon, I get home from school and I shoot a car window out. That could fall into this scheme, and I think there has to be some limitation in time, so that if you're on a spree, that's one thing, but it's another if you just have a pattern of conduct where you're doing some kind of damage to something.
I think there are some boundaries that have been in place as the theft statutes have been tested, and that's where I think that's going to come in. That guidance will come in from those theft statutes and aggregation to help guide us in this direction as well.
Okay, well, these defendants probably need to know what it is, too.
Absolutely.
Right, okay. Good, thank you for being here.
The language is exactly the same as in the theft statute that's been there for years.
Okay. Any other proponents of LB 104? Seeing none, we will take opponent testimony.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Spike Eicholt, S-P-I-K-E-E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T, appearing on behalf of the ACLU of Nebraska and the Criminal Defense Attorneys Association in opposition to the bill. We oppose the bill for at least the stated and implied reasons why the County Attorneys Association representative testified in support of the bill. The only thing this bill does is it allows the prosecutor of the state to aggregate loss amounts among different victims to increase their charging power. When asked by Senator Brandt, the earlier testifier, explained that's not necessarily her intent to charge people as felonies. That's the only thing the bill does. It accomplishes that stacking of dollar amounts to make it a felony. Felony charges matter. They matter, felony convictions certainly matter because it matters for voting rights. It matters for other rights for loss of certain privileges and licenses you can get from the state. It matters in the juvenile context. You know from earlier bills that we've heard earlier this year. So charging a juvenile with a felony or felonies matters. And this bill does have some problems with that in that regard. I know that we do allow for aggregation in the theft and forgery statutes, and the language admittedly is the same. I would argue it's a little bit different here. Because in the theft cases, the courts have sort of interpreted what same scheme means. It's situations where I get a checkbook of someone else and I'm writing checks one after the other to different stores. Or I get someone's credit card and I use that card at different opportunities. It's one singular course, sometimes it's a single day, sometimes multiple days. And that's not necessarily the same with criminal mischief, vandalism type crimes. You might have sprees where kids go out, and it usually is, according to the earlier testifier, young juveniles who go out and commit these kind of crimes, smash up windows and smash up mailboxes and do that kind of thing. But allowing the aggregation for those is a little different because you don't have that same deliberate scheme that you have with the fraud type crimes and the theft type crimes. This is juvenile, it's random, sometimes it's reckless, and it's not always intentional and deliberate. And I think it is particularly problematic. And it's based on everything seems to have to be a felony. Everything seems to have to get more and more punitive, and that's what the other side seemingly always asks for. And it's based on what I would argue, especially in the juvenile setting, it's just a false assumption. Kids aren't going out there and getting 9 windows and said, hey, well, we're done. We're almost to a felony level. Let's go home. It doesn't work that way. They do dumb things that aren't thought out, and getting them exposed to felony level prosecution is just really problematic. I urge the committee not to advance the bill.
Let's start with Senator DeBoer. Won't you, Senator Bray?
So now I'm going to push back on you since I pushed back on the prosecutor.
That's fine.
Just because, okay, if I go down the street and I hit 9 cars in a row and I break all the windows out, 10 cars, $5,000, whatever, happen to all be owned by the same person.
Like a dealership or something.
Sure. Or I just have a lot of cars parked on the street, right? That would be felony because it'd be one victim, right?
Yeah, if it's the same identifiable victim and they own all the property, yeah, and that's
So now, 9 people, I have 9 cars and the 10th car belongs to Brandt. I do exactly the same thing. Now it's not a felony, right?
That's right.
So, I mean, there is a little bit of a question of just because they happen to be owned by different people, if the act, the unlawful action of breaking those windows is the same action, just because by circumstance I happen to be unlucky enough to get the same people owning them. I mean, do you see the problem?
I do see the problem. Now, the stated reason from the earlier testifier was it was just too inconvenient for them to prosecute that as separate misdemeanors and too much work for the judge to read the charges. I don't think that should necessarily be a justification for allowing aggregation for convenience of prosecuting people with felonies.
Sure.
That's not directly responsive to what he said.
No, it's not responsive to what I said. I mean, if the scheme, if what we're trying to do is rehabilitate, deter, or punish a scheme of behavior, it shouldn't matter if there are 2 owners or 1 owner that is the victim of the same behavior, right?
Right. But at the same time, I don't think level of offense is necessarily dispositive of whether somebody can be rehabilitated and whether a victim can be made whole.
Sure. Okay. Thanks.
Senator Brand.
Thank you, Chairman Lathrop. Thank you, Mr. Eichholt. I guess she addressed exactly, I was going to come back on the other side and say, shouldn't it matter that we've got 10 that obviously look like one crime with 10 different owners? And I think we got a little sidetracked today because we're saying it's 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds. What if it was a bunch of 60-year-old guys on a drunken spree? I mean, everybody'd be out to hang them, wouldn't they?
I don't know. I mean, I think people are always kind of frustrated with kids, right? I think that there's kind of initial reaction. But you're right. I mean, if somebody's an adult and does these things, people are just as angry. And certainly from the victim perspective, it doesn't really matter whether it's a child that did it or not. It is inconvenient. But the bill doesn't address the victim compensation fund. It doesn't address the restitution statutes or anything else that's already available that's not going to be impact one way or the other by passing the bill.
All right. Thank you.
So we've been doing this with theft. I got a question I probably should have asked the prosecutor, but let's say that there are, somebody writes, what do you have, how much do you have to
For a felony?
steal from somebody to make a felony out of it?
$1,500.
$1,500?
Yeah.
So let's say I write 3 checks and they come up to $1,400. Are they charging 3 misdemeanors? Or are they just charging them with 1?
Somebody's charged with 2 felonies and a misdemeanor. If it's $1,500 or more, I see what you're saying. So say it's slightly
If it's
less.
$1,500 and they don't get to $1,500,
They're charging it as a felony. They charge it as a felony. If they can aggregate the amounts,
if they can aggregate it and get it over $1,500, my question is, what if there's 3 of them but they don't get to $1,500? They're still charging. We're still doing the 3 misdemeanors, right?
That's right. The way it works, particularly with felony cases, you charge, it's technical stuff, but they will prefer to always lead on the felony charge first, because it starts in county court. When it's bound over to district court, you can add misdemeanors after the fact. So that regularly happens. If they can get to a felony, at least in Lancaster County, they start with a felony. You just got leverage. If you want to get them to pay restitution back under the threat of adding other charges or the promise to reduce this charge, you got to start high. As I said before in other contexts, 90-some% of your cases plus are resolved by pleas. This puts more power on their negotiating side. And that might make some sense, I suppose, if you look at it from the victim perspective, but I'd argue that they have enough leverage now because they can get class 1 misdemeanors 0 to a year. That's a pretty significant hammer.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting bill because there's pretty good arguments on both sides of this. Certainly I see it from the victim's perspective, which is, you know, you run down the street and you slam 10 windshields and you get over $5,000 or however many it takes. Right. If you go into a car dealership, it's a felony. If you hit people one at a time out on a street where everybody parks on the street or in an apartment parking lot. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff we get over here in Judiciary Committee. We always have a good discussion, and you're part of it almost all the time. Thanks for being here. Anyone else here to testify in opposition to LB 104? Anyone here in a neutral capacity on 104? Seeing none, Senator Friesen, you may close. As you get comfortable in the seat, let the record reflect that we have a position letter that is in support, and we have no written testimony. Welcome back.
Thank you, Chairman Lathrop. So listening to the discussion, it was great. I kind of enjoyed being here. I come at it more when they talk to me about this bill. I looked at it more from the victim standpoint than whoever did it. I didn't care what age they were. It goes back to that personal responsibility. You did something. And let's make the picture a little bigger. Let's say they did 100 cars in one night. And this gives that prosecutor some options. They don't have to do it. I, for one, if I was one of those victims, I'm saying, why didn't you prosecute my case? So should a prosecutor bring 50 separate cases to the court? I don't think that makes a lot of sense either. And so suddenly you're charged with 50 misdemeanor counts of whatever. Does that add up? Does the punishment fit the crime? And so I guess I looked at it strictly from the victim standpoint, and you could see that somebody in a whole block of cars, all these cars got damaged, and they charged to prosecute this case over here, and that's it. And you're saying, what about me? You're just ignoring me. And so I guess that's where I feel that at times, if the cases are big enough, the numbers are high enough, this should be an option. And again, I think there is too many times we are not looking from the victim side. We're always saying that the perpetrator of these incidents, they're young, they're stupid, just out doing crazy stuff. But there are real consequences in life as you get older. The next crime is going to be that much worse. And so that's why I looked at it. I'm glad to answer any questions you may have.
Well, let's make sure Senator Pansy Brooks doesn't have one for you.
You don't have to look.
I do, believe me. Yeah, I don't see any. No, thanks for being here, and thanks for introducing LB 104. It's been a good discussion. We appreciate it. That will close our hearing on LB 104 and bring us to LB 319 and Senator John Kavanaugh. Change penalties for theft offenses.
Nice comment.
Senator Kavanaugh, welcome back.
Thank you, Chairman Lathrop, and thank you, Judiciary Committee. It feels like it's been a long time. Good afternoon. Once again, my name is John Kavanaugh, John-Cavanaugh. I represent the 9th Legislative District in Midtown Omaha, and I'm here introducing LB 319, which is to add a 15-year look-back period for enhancement of theft offenses. Basically, this would apply to all theft offenses, but I like to use the example of shoplifting. So, first offense shoplifting is a Class 2 misdemeanor. It carries up to 6 months. A second offense can be a Class 1, and then a third offense would be a Class 4 felony. Those are enhanceable regardless of whether that first shoplifting happened in 1990, second in 2005, and the third in 2020, or if all offenses happened in 2020. In practice, most repeat shoplifters don't go long stretches without being rearrested. This bill will recognize the reality that if someone goes a long period without a law violation, that they are not as serious a threat to society as someone who commits multiple crimes in quick succession. There is precedent in Nebraska law. We currently have a 15-year look-back period for DUI offenses, which means if a person is convicted with three DUIs decades apart, they'd have each one treated as a first offense, while a person who's shoplifting for food at a grocery store once every decade and a half would be charged with a felony. LB 319 represents a modest step in reforming this sentencing. I want to thank you, the members of the Judiciary Committee, and I respectfully ask you to advance LB 319, and I'd be happy to take any questions. So, trying to be
questions for Senator Kavanaugh? I see none. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Introduction. Anyone here to testify in support of LB 319? Say while you're getting comfortable that we did have a little fun with waiting on Senator Pansy Brooks, and she actually did send something, but it took a while for it to go through the internet. We should have talked to Senator Friesen about broadband while he was here.
I'm sure she'll understand.
Well, let's hope so.
Thank you, members of the
welcome.
committee. My name is Spike Eichhold, S-P-I-K-E-E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T, appearing on behalf of the Nebraska Criminal Defense Attorneys Association in support of LB 319. We want to thank Senator John Kavanaugh for introducing the bill. He explained what the bill does. It's pretty straightforward. This is what I would call a modest reform to our enhanceability crime statute. This is a smaller version of our 3 strikes law when it comes to theft. If it's a third offense shoplift, third offense theft, it can be charged as a felony regardless of the dollar amount or the value for either the prior offenses or the instant case. And this limits the look-back period, so to speak, for prior convictions. I don't know how many cases it will really impact because, like Senator John Kavanaugh said, many times when people are committing these subsequent or serial thefts, it's part of a drug addiction. They're sort of in it for a bad part of their life, and they're usually pretty short in time. But you do have some instances where somebody has a real old. I'm thinking of a case where a guy dished out on a cab driver or a cab ride years ago, was charged with theft of services, was convicted, and then got a subsequent shoplift that they enhanced with an older conviction. We already have the limit for prior convictions for DUI offenses, and it would make some sense to have this as well. We would urge the committee to advance the bill.
Okay. Any questions for Senator DeBoer?
Sorry, one quick question. You said that we have this look-back scheme in DUI. Is there any other place in the law where we have this sort of thing?
We don't have any limit for habitual criminal prior convictions, so they can go back forever. We don't have it we have enhanceable crimes in other contexts, protection order violations. You heard domestic assault earlier. A lot of those haven't been on the books for even 15 years. A lot of those were passed 10 years ago, 12, well, maybe close to 15, but not many of them.
Okay.
There seems to be a recent trend, so to speak.
Okay.
I don't see any other questions. Thanks for being here. Any other proponents of LB 319? Anyone here to speak in opposition? None. Anybody here to speak in a neutral capacity? Seeing none, Senator Kavanaugh, you may close.
Unless there is any questions, I will.
Anybody? Doesn't look like it. Senator Kavanaugh waves close. We did not have any position letters and we had no written testimony. We will close the hearing on LB 319 and that brings us to Senator Michaela Kavanaugh. Testified on LB 187. Two? Okay, you can call Senator Hush too.
Sorry, I'm in the middle of another hearing. Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop and members of the committee. I am Michaela Kavanaugh, M-A-C-H-A-E-L-A-C-A-V-A-N-A-U-G-H. I should have asked, is it okay for me to start?
I can't hear you.
Is it okay for me to start?
Yes, yes.
Sorry.
Absolutely.
Okay. I represent District 6, West Central Omaha in the Nebraska Legislature. I'm here today to introduce LB 187. I introduced LB 187 to add language to the definition of sexual penetration. This change is needed to better address criminal sexual offenses that involve object manipulation. The current definition of sexual penetration as it relates to criminal sexual offenses does include object manipulation, but it is limited to object manipulation when it is done by the actor. Unfortunately, there are also instances where the actor or perpetrator is directing the sexual assault victim to manipulate an object, either on or into themselves or the perpetrator, or to the perpetrator. Our statutes do not adequately address this horrible situation, so as you can see, the language we are adding to the statutes would specifically include instances where the object manipulation is done by the victim at the request or direction of the actor. I was asked to bring this legislation based on cases that county attorneys have been involved with, and there will be an attorney following me who will be able to tell you about how their experience in this area of law led to this proposed change. The defense attorneys are bringing a proposed amendment, and I believe Mr. Eichholt will be bringing that and speaking to it, and I support the amendment, and I'm not sure if I'll be here to close, but I will take any questions if you have them.
I don't see any questions.
Great.
You will not be here, you're waving close.
I will come back if I can.
Okay, well, it won't be long.
Okay.
Okay. Proponents of the bill may come forward. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lathrop and members of the Judiciary Committee. I would first ask if you can hear me. I know I can be soft-spoken, so I'm trying to project.
You're doing fine.
Thank you. My name is Tanya Soukup, Tonia Soukup. I am the Deputy County Attorney in both Butler and Colfax counties, and I'm here to testify today in support of LB 187 on behalf of the Nebraska County Attorneys Association. As Senator Kavanaugh stated in her introduction, as it relates to the definition of sexual penetration and utilizing objects, the current law only prohibits a person from using an object to penetrate the victim, but it does not prohibit a perpetrator from directing or forcing a victim into utilizing the object in any other sexual manner. It may seem difficult to imagine that this scenario would exist, unfortunately, but it does. As our office in Butler County discovered when the Butler County attorney was assigned as a special prosecutor for a case out of another county in our district. In that case, an adult male had propositioned his minor stepdaughter to utilize a sex toy, or in this case, a fake penis that he referred to in his instruction to her as a strap-on. He requested that she utilize that object on him. Had she done so, that contact would have resulted in that child engaging in an act of sexual penetration that would have consisted of her inserting that object into the anal opening of the adult at the request or direction of the adult. And had that contact occurred, the current definition of sexual penetration would have precluded our office from charging that adult with a criminal sexual offense, simply because of the definition of the term in the statute of sexual penetration. It is our opinion that this omission from the legal definition amounts to a loophole in the law, and we believe that it should be closed. I believe that there's little doubt that the act of directing or forcing another person, whether that be a child or an unwilling adult, to engage in this kind of sexual activity does constitute sexual penetration and would be equally traumatic to that victim, regardless of whether the object was used on them or if the perpetrator directed how that should be used. In any case, the perpetrator is using an object to make the victim engage in an act of sexual penetration. This bill would allow such a case to be analyzed on a consent analysis as opposed to precluding that consent analysis based on definitional limitations, and would recognize that victims are often unable or unwilling or legally unable to consent to such activity. It is our position that this activity should be included in the definition of sexual penetration. I thank you for your consideration of LB 187, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
I got a question for you.
Yes.
Does this only apply if there's some kind of penetration?
This is specific to the definition of sexual penetration, yes. There is second and third degree sexual assault that encompasses sexual contact that does not include penetration. And that definition of sexual contact does already encompass a perpetrator causing the victim to contact the perpetrator.
That was going to be my next question. If this doesn't become law and that person that you've described that you were involved in this prosecution, if that person would have been successful in having this child use this object to penetrate this perpetrator, you still would have had things to charge him with, right?
Maybe it would have been pretty fact specific. We would have had to prove and have the child be able to tell us that he caused her to touch his genitals in some other way. Additionally, I believe there was a a charge of child abuse and things of that nature considered, but there would have been nothing to specifically address the act of sexual penetration.
Okay. Okay, I see Mr. Eichel on the edge of his chair, so I'm sure we're going to get the counterpoint here in just a moment. But
certainly.
Any questions for this testifier? I see none. Thanks for coming down today.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Any other proponents? Seeing none, we will take opponent testimony. Now he's shaking his head. No, how about neutral testimony? Okay. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Spike Eichholt, Spikeeichholt, appearing on behalf of the Nebraska Criminal Defense Attorney Association in a neutral capacity. Following up on what Senator Michaela Kavanaugh explained in her introduction, that we did approach her and the County Attorneys Association with a concern that our association had. And I'm having, or at least you're being given a copy of an amendment that I did share with them and Senator Kavanaugh, that we would ask the committee to incorporate into the bill. And I think that Senator Michaela Kavanaugh said that she's in support of it. And what it would do, on page 3, line 3, after the word slight, or after the word is, it would insert the phrase performed in the actor's presence. The concern that we have with the bill as written is that this changes the general definition of sexual penetration that applies throughout different types of sexual assault, including statutory rape. I didn't immediately realize it until members on my committee who do a lot more of these kind of cases. That's a common thing to do for kids that are admittedly in an inappropriate relationship, but on FaceTime or social media somehow to sort of get involved in these sexting type behaviors where the children, the young people generally, are touching themselves at the direction or suggestion of the others. Now, I don't think that was the intent of the bill. We don't want to let people be charged with sexual assault when they're not even actually in the physical presence of one another, and that's why we asked the committee to incorporate that language, so there would be the requirement that the actor and the victim be in the same physical presence with one another during the penetration. And I'll answer any questions anyone has.
We got to allow a little bit of time for these questions to come in. Otherwise, with this amendment, you're okay? Criminal defense attorney's all right with this?
Oh, there was some on the committee that perhaps didn't really like it, but I think what you said before, it is consistent with the sexual contact definition in that it can be sort of both ways, so to speak, that makes it a law violation to have sexual contact with one another. And I think consistent as amended, it would be consistent with that spirit where you can have penetration either at the direction or subjected to by the actor or the defendant. That would make some sense, as long as it has the physical presence requirement. That was the biggest concern that we had.
Okay. All right, well, you and the county attorneys agree. Any questions for Mr. Eichel? I don't see any other neutral testimony. Seeing that Senator Kavanaugh's not here to close, so we'll take that as a waiver. Before we close out the hearing, though, on LB 186, there are 2 position letters, both proponent, and we have written testimony from 2 sources. One's Corey O'Brien with the Attorney General's Office, who is a proponent, Robert Sanford, also a proponent with the Nebraska Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. With that, we will close our hearing on LB 187. And that brings us to Senator Hunt and LB 229. Senator, welcome.
Thank you, Chairman Lathrop and members of the committee. It's nice to see you all get out of our committees and see some other faces. My name is Senator Megan Hunt, MEGAN-HUNT. I represent District 8 in Midtown Omaha, Nebraska. Today, I am scheduled to introduce LB 229, a bill to add gender identity to our hate crime statute, which would provide for enhanced penalties for crimes motivated by someone's gender identity or perceived gender identity. This is the second time I've introduced this bill, and I introduced it this year with a little bit of hesitation, and I'm going to follow through with that hesitation because I am committed to reducing the number of system-involved and incarcerated people in Nebraska, and I'm committed to interrupting the cycles of violence that are perpetuated by our prison system, and I don't think that LB 229 is compatible with that goal. So for that reason, I think I might actually try to withdraw the bill, and I would ask the committee not to take any action on it. And I just want to say a few things for the record and for anybody watching about why it is that I would like to not pursue this legislation. A lot of advocates for a long time have argued that in order to seek justice for LGBTQ plus people, we have to move away from seeking carceral solutions. We have to move away from seeking solutions that involve state-sponsored violence through the justice system, and I agree with that. Persistent and systemic cycles of anti-LGBTQ plus violence aren't going to be stopped by incarcerating more people for more periods of time. My goals of true social justice depend on building compassionate, fair, and understanding relationships with our different communities. And to do that, I think that we have to challenge the established framework, the business as usual, in which we understand and respond to violence, especially as a state, including homophobic and transphobic violence. For that reason, I realize it's wrong to empower the state to commit more state-sanctioned violence. We have to think beyond the criminal legal system for workable solutions, and I promise to do my best to ally with advocates and organizations that are already doing this work so that we can use my platform as a state senator to further these goals. I also know that many LGBTQ plus people don't seek law enforcement assistance when they experience homophobic or transphobic violence. Sometimes it's because they're afraid of disclosure of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Sometimes they have a disincentive to report because of language barriers or because of their immigration status or participation in illegal economic activities such as sex work, or simply the perception that police forces, which have historically persecuted queer communities, may not care, may not believe the victim, and may even respond with violence of their own. I brought this bill originally and for the second time this year because our hate crime statutes already include enhanced penalties for race, color, religion, ancestry, national origin, gender, and sexual orientation. And so it stands to reason, like the gut check is there, that, well, we should include gender identity there too, so that it's completely encompassing of all LGBTQ identities. But perhaps this existing statute, while well-intentioned, is also misguided. I don't want to support any pursuit of justice that diverts resources away from programs and initiatives that address the root causes of poverty and inequality. So for that reason, I will no longer pursue this legislation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that explanation too, Senator Hunt. We still have to go ahead with our hearing, however.
Understood.
And, yeah, but that's okay. Are you going to waive a close?
I will waive closing.
Okay, thanks,
you.
Senator Hunt. Are there proponents of LB 229 that wish to be heard? Can you pull that chair out of the way? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, members of the committee.
Good afternoon.
In concord with what the Senator Hunt said, I'm fully willing to, go along with what the community, the LGBTQ community, and the senator wish to do. However,
Can we have you state your name, though? You're going to have to state your name and spell it for the record so we know.
That's correct.
Transcript.
My name is Vincent Litwinowitz, VincentLitwinowicz. And so this is about a 4-minute and 15-second speech. And
How about we give you a little more time today?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And it's kind of a prelude to Friday. And, okay, so using my gradual, lifelong, final, and complete acceptance and very recent public revelation of my own gender identity issues that I have experienced for as long as I can remember, I would like to express my full support for LB 229, which has changed in accordance with what the senator said. This bill is necessary. As a segue to why LB 229 is necessary, it feels good to release the tender-hearted and loving soul that I can only describe as largely feminine, and it is not a fetish. This feminine feeling has been embedded deeply inside me, and I would like to at last express myself outwardly in some ways accordingly. I only want to be the person I am naturally born to be. For example, as you can see, and as I settle into the person that is me, I would like to at least sometimes wear clothing that would reflect my feminine nature because it feels good as an inward and outward expression of who I am. In other words, I actually, in this way, get to feel, reinforce, and show the world and myself who I am in some still borderline but culturally acceptable ways. And I'm not sure exactly of all it didn't really get printed in entirety. If you don't mind, I can pull out my phone or I can stop.
Well, I think we get the point. If you have any other comments or remarks,
we're good.
We'd be happy to listen.
Yeah, we're good. Okay. So that's fine. I didn't realize the senator had withdrawn it, and so I kind of agree with her on that as well. But as far as I'm not the kind of person necessarily who can hold my tongue, and if I'm confronted with someone, if I verbally reduce them to rubble, which is possible, there may be a price to pay. For me, I would try to handle myself like an adult, but at times it might be a problem. So with that, I will just say thanks for listening.
Well, thanks for coming down here today. I think it takes a good deal of courage to come here and testify as you have today.
Thank you.
Appreciate hearing from you.
Thank you, and members of the committee.
I don't see any questions for you today, Vincent, but thanks for being here and for your participation in the process.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually wrote it out well, and part of it got deleted, so we're good.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Anyone else here to testify in support of LB 229? Seeing none. Anyone here to testify as an opponent? Anyone in the neutral capacity? Seeing none, that will close the testimony. We have 10 position letters. 7 of those position letters are proponents, 3 are opponent, and we also have written testimony received this morning from Nate Grass with Nebraska Family Alliance. He is opposed to LB 229, as is Marion Miner and the Nebraska Catholic Conference. That completes the record and closes our hearing on LB 229 and brings us to our last bill of the day, and that would be LB 360 and our own Senator Pansy Brooks, who has her legislative assistant standing in today, given that she's in quarantine. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Chair Lathrop and members of the Judiciary Committee. For the record, I am Chris Tribish, CHRISTRIEBSCH. I am here today to introduce LB 360 on behalf of Senator Pansy Brooks, who is in quarantine and watching this hearing via NET. LB 360 creates a yes means yes standard so that victims of sexual assault are better protected under the law. The yes means yes standard is also often known as affirmative consent. The senator previously brought this bill in light of the Me Too and Time's Up movements. Since the original bill, we were fortunate to work with the county attorneys who drafted this version of the bill. Affirmative consent is a knowing, voluntary, and mutual decision among all participants to engage in sexual activity, according to Chandler Della Mater with the Albany Law Review. Consent can be given by words or actions as long as those words or actions create clear permission to engage in sexual activity. Silence or lack of resistance in and of itself does not demonstrate consent. The definition of consent does not vary based upon a participant's sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. This is exactly what this bill is working to address. This bill is more than a definitional change. This bill is about empowering survivors of sexual assault who seek justice from their attacker. It does not change the intimacy of consensual sexual activity. Instead, it reframes the way our legal system will approach situations in which individuals did not give voluntary, conscious, and mutual consent in sexual encounters. Under this bill, consent is present when it is knowingly and voluntarily given either verbally or through overt actions. When there is no indication through words or conduct that someone is willing to engage in an intimate encounter with another, consent has either not been given or has been withdrawn. It is important to remember that consent can be withdrawn at any time if either participant feels unsafe, threatened, or violated. Regardless of previous or current relationships, consent must be present before engaging in sexual activity. In 2017, Montana enacted a law similar to the one before you today, as their statutes at the time did not account for victims who were unable to consent due to freezing during an attack. Missoula Deputy County Attorney Susie Boylan has pointed out that offenders were able to take advantage of victims who neither said yes or no before Montana implemented their affirmative consent law. For those who may not think that this is a relevant problem, I want to take a minute to stress the importance of action on this issue. Della Mater from the Albany Law Review has stated it is, quote, "It is still the case in many jurisdictions today that a mere lack of consent is insufficient to establish rape," unquote. In fact, a constituent reached out to our office on this piece of legislation to express her support. She explained that as juror in a sexual assault case, her jury had trouble convicting the alleged attacker in the case due to the fact that the victim never said no, though she also never said yes. Consent is not passive. The current no means no standard presumes that when there is not a no, then that means there must be a yes. It implies that an individual, often a woman, is constantly consenting to have sex unless she is able to say no. We want to stress that this bill does not put the burden of proof on the person who has been accused. Bobby Villarreal, executive director of the Dallas Rape Crisis Center, has explained that, quote, "Rape is the only crime in which we turn the lens onto the survivor, the victim, and not onto the perpetrator. When someone gets shot, we don't even ask them, why didn't you get away from that bullet?" Unquote. Right now, the burden of sexual assault falls squarely onto the shoulders of the victims of this terrible crime. This bill can lead survivors to come forward with the knowledge that they will be protected under better standards for consent and will not have their cases dismissed because they were so brutalized, unconscious, or threatened that they could not say no. Finally, for those of you that may be struggling with this different way of approaching consent, I want to refer to a video the senator's cousin once sent her. Consent is as simple as tea. If you offer someone a cup of tea and they say yes, that would be wonderful, then you could give them a cup of tea. If someone did not want a cup of tea, you would not force them to drink it. Sometimes people even change their mind when they say they want a cup of tea, and while it could be annoying, you should not force them to drink the tea. Also, there is no way someone who is unconscious could answer whether or not they want a cup of tea. So there is no point in even making them tea. Unconscious people do not want tea, even if they said they did earlier. Just because you made someone tea last week, that does not mean they would want it next time. If you can understand when someone wants tea, then we should be able to do the same with sex. Senator Pansy Brooks asked you to advance LB 360 to general file.
Okay. Thanks for being here, Chris. We appreciate hearing that introduction. We don't really have questions for you, or can, so we'll go on to proponent testimony. Anybody here to testify as a proponent? Good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Lathrop, members of the committee. My name is Kristen McTaggart. I'm from the Women's Fund of Omaha. I'm spelling CHRISTON, last name MACTAGGART. Women's Fund's here to testify in support of LB 360, clarifying the definition of without consent for instances of sexual assault to reflect more trauma-informed understandings of victim response to violence. Consent to engage in sexual contact and penetration should not be based upon the absence of no. Common responses to violence and trauma include fight, flight, or freeze responses. However, recognition of a freeze response is largely absent in our current statute and definitions of consent. So in many cases, survivors of sexual assault want to say no or resist, but could not because they froze. It's a response that's called tonic immobility. And in this biological trauma response, victims experience involuntary paralysis. It's the same trauma response common in other scenarios, such as soldiers during war or animals who play dead when faced with a predator threat. They're conscious, they know what's happening, but they physically cannot speak or move their body. It includes cases where there are no other verbal threats or physical violence beyond the rape, and it often occurs early and before the initiation of physical violence, when a victim perceives what's coming, but before they have the ability to offer verbal or physical defense. Much of the current research on neurobiology around trauma and tonic immobility has been done or has been derived from sexual assault. And the research is consistent in that between 50 to 70% of sexual assault victims experience tonic immobility during a sexual assault. Victim service providers and national best practices already acknowledge the research. They've long provided that sexual acts are assault unless there's affirmative and enthusiastic physical or verbal consent. Survivors of sexual assault experience shame or self-blame for violence they've endured, and statutes that require them to identify that they verbally or physically said no or resisted validates that stigma. We believe that the current definition, or the definition of assault in this bill is more in line with the science, and we respectfully urge the committee's support of LB 360 and advancement to general file. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Any questions for Ms. McTaggart? I don't see any, but thanks for being here. We appreciate hearing from the Women's Fund. Next proponent. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to the Judiciary Committee.
Thank you for having me, Chairman Lathrop, and members of the Judiciary Committee. For the record, my name is Brody Weber. That's spelled BRODEYWEBER. And today I'm speaking in favor of Legislative Bill 360. As I've mentioned over the past few years, this bill has been personal to me, and I've been working closely with Senator Patty Pansy Brooks and her very talented staff to pass an affirmative consent standard like Montana's since 2017. There's a reason why I am so passionate about this bill. I attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln from fall of 2016 to the spring of 2020 and earned a degree in communication studies. I was fortunate enough to have a strong support system in college, and in the spring of 2017, I had a dear friend who was sexually assaulted by an acquaintance while attending a social event off campus. The next morning, I woke up around 5 a.m. to a phone call. This was not a normal call. My friend, for the first time since I had known her, sounded utterly broken. I knew that something was wrong. Later that day, she had to undergo multiple tests and interrogations that I would not wish upon my very worst enemy. When I asked her why she was so hesitant to go to the authorities in order to seek justice, she replied because she did not technically ever say no while the assault was occurring. I asked her if she had said yes, and she had not. She was unable to say anything due to the state of shock. Not only was her voice unheard, but she was failed by our justice system. I find this loophole in our justice system both deeply disturbing and unacceptable. I'm not just here, though, for my friend. I'm here for every single survivor whose silence is coerced by the violence of an assault and then a system that fails to fight for them. It is not too much for us to expect that individuals who are engaging in intimate activities reach a clear and voluntary agreement to do so. It is a change given our history with the no means no standard, but this is actually quite simple. For example, when you vote on a bill, abstaining is not the same as a yes. In order to actually pass a bill, you have to clearly say yes. According to Chandler Delamater of the Albany Law Review, the current sexual assault standard places the burden on victims to specifically note their unwillingness to engage in sexual activity. He later goes on to point out, as Chris mentioned, that in many jurisdictions, the lack of consent is insufficient to establish rape. What's good about affirmative consent is that it means both partners must express their wishes in a way that other partners can grasp. Senators, I want to leave you with this last thought. Every day that you walk these halls, you have the incredible opportunity to make history. I'm jealous of you. Today you get a choice. You get to choose if you are on the right side of history and fight for survivors and their justice, or to maintain a system that leaves far too many voiceless. And I have confidence in all of you to make the right choice out there. Thank you for your time, and I welcome any and all questions about this subject.
I do not see any questions at this time, Mr. Weber, but thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
You do the same. Any other proponents? Sorry.
No, that's fine.
I got a late text, or a text came in from Senator Pansy Brooks. And there's a delay here, and it's not helpful. But anyway, that's not your problem, right? Welcome.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Lathrop, members of the Judiciary Committee. My name is Meg Mikolajczyk, M-E-G-M-I-K-O-L-A-J-C-Z-Y-K. I'm the Deputy Director and Legal Counsel at Planned Parenthood here in Nebraska, and I'm freely giving my informed, enthusiastic, and specific support of LB 360. Thank you, Senator Pansy Brooks, wherever you are right now, for continuing your advocacy on this issue and for introducing this bill. Planned Parenthood's vision is one where communities recognize sexual and reproductive rights as basic human rights, and where every person has the opportunity to lead a healthy, meaningful life. And this vision only becomes reality if people have full bodily autonomy, the right to make decisions about what is and is not right for that person and their body at all times. Planned Parenthood supports LB 360 because this bill returns bodily autonomy and respect to all people. It is best practice in sexual and reproductive education and healthcare. The bill ensures that all persons involved in sexual activities are willing participants throughout the entire experience. No one should be presumed to be constantly consenting to sexual activity. So a culture shift towards expecting to hear yes before moving forward and knowing that your partner won't make further advances until a yes is spoken is crucial. It's not enough to obtain consent at the beginning of the sexual experience. Both people reserve the right to terminate the activity at any time. And this ensures that all participants are able to set boundaries and that those boundaries are respected. Seeking permission instead of assuming it
is exceptionally important in the many different ways power imbalances present themselves in potential sexual relationships in our country. When there is a power imbalance between two people, one person may fear saying no or actively resisting. It may negatively impact their entire career, their education, their job, their family, and so on. So requiring the initiator to receive affirmative approval restructures that power dynamic and allows people to actively set their boundaries. Shifting from no means no to yes means yes as a framework may have some challenges at first. It's hard for us to all sort of shift from what we've learned growing up. The public will need a re-education in sexual relationships. In fact, 1 in 5 college students currently think that as long as someone has not said no, that they've consented, but just because this bill requires new thinking, that's not a reason to not embrace this idea. And in fact, I would actually say that's evidence that we do need to do this shift, because that's not okay. Affirmative consent leads to healthier, more fulfilled relationships, and it also makes for a more sex-positive community. It may lead to more open discussion about potential risks like STDs and pregnancy, and it also challenges stereotypes like the idea that rape is a women's issue. Imagine a world where instead of grilling a sexual assault survivor on the witness stand about what she's wearing, how hard she resisted, or whether or not she audibly said no, these questions were posed to both people. Did you ask? Did they say yes? That's it. Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any questions. Thank you. Before the next person comes up, you're fine. Thanks. I should say to Brody Weber, because you were in Senator Pansy Brooks's office at one time, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you worked on this issue for a long time. Senator Pansy Brooks, I know, is completely frustrated that she can't be here to express her appreciation for your work on this issue. So on her behalf, thanks for being here today and all the work you put into this issue. Now we will take the next proponent. Good afternoon.
Hello. My name is Abigail Coren, spelled Abigail Coren. I passed out a fuller testimony, but I'm just going to do a little bit more consistent or smaller. I am here today to testify about my daughter's experience to show why LB 360 is needed. A little more than 2 years ago, my daughter was viciously raped in our basement while the rest of the family was home and asleep. She was lonely and chatting with a young man in high school who had heard salacious rumors about her. This older boy was a football player and a wrestler at his high school, weighing 220 pounds. My daughter was 13 years old, depressed, and weighed 100 pounds. My daughter did initially invite her rapist over to our house with the intention of having sex with him, but she did not find him attractive and did not enjoy how he was treating her and told him to stop. After he left, my daughter texted him to say that he raped her. He responded that she was a liar and a slut. I called the police. We had a report taken. The officer took samples of her rapist's DNA from the carpet and couch. He took her phone. We then went to Brian West to have a SANE kit taken. Her entire body was examined and photographed. Her clothing was taken away. When I asked the officer taking the report about Nebraska law and whether consent can be withdrawn after initially being given, we were told that no means no, and the law supports that stance. Everyone told us they were sorry that she went through such an awful experience and that they believed what she said happened to her. However, the way that our experience panned out proves this is not true. We were advised to go to the Child Advocacy Center to have an interview recorded by the police about what happened to my daughter. When I asked the advocate if I needed to hire a lawyer, I was told it would probably be unnecessary for me to do so since the interests of the state aligns with our interests. So we waited for the police to do their job and for our day in court. That day never came. 5 months after my daughter was raped, the child advocate on our case informed me that the investigating officer would not be recommending charges against my daughter's rapist. I contacted the officer who made this decision and asked why he wasn't going to arrest this young man. I was told that since his parents hired a lawyer, there was no way to get a confession that he committed rape. I asked why the same kit and my daughter's recorded testimony didn't serve as enough evidence, and was told that the same kit only proves that she had sex, and without being able to interview the young man, he was unable to prove that it happened as she said, since there were no witnesses. I asked if this is the same when a person is assaulted and develops a black eye. Does the perpetrator need to confess to the attack if no one witnesses it? The answer I was told was that the physical evidence of the black eye is enough evidence to arrest the aggressor, but in the case of rape, it is a he said, she said situation. And if he refuses to say anything, there is not enough evidence to convict. I'm sorry, there's a red light.
Let's see if there's any questions for you. We do have your testimony. We can read through that as well. Any questions for this testifier? I don't see any at this time. Thanks for coming down and sharing your family's experience. It's not just your daughter, it's your whole family, isn't it?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Anyone else here as a proponent of LB 360 that wishes to be heard? Anyone here as an opponent?
Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Spike Eichel, S-P-I-K-E-E-I-C-K-H-O-L-T, appearing in opposition to LB 360 on behalf of the Nebraska Criminal Defense Attorneys Association. Anything I say is not meant to somehow endorse anything or approve of anything that's been done to anybody that's improper, particularly the people who are here today in the same room with me. This bill has been introduced before in different versions and we've opposed it before. This is a little less objectionable to us, but after some discussion, our association decided to oppose it. I understand what the proponents are saying, that they want to move to a yes means yes standard, but I'm not sure when you look at the actual written proposed language, it does that. If anything, it adds on some uncertainty to the existing law, which I would concede is pretty well settled against a no means no presumption. I've had several sexual assault cases where I've defended people who've been found guilty and not guilty. I've never, ever argued she didn't say no as a defense. That's not a valid defense. Consent and lack thereof can be proven by all kinds of evidence, circumstantial and direct. The specific concerns that we have about LB 360 is the language that is on pages 3, 4, and 5 that references that same phrase, whether sexual penetration was done without consent, may be inferred upon all the surrounding circumstances, etc. That phrase is kind of odd because it almost reads like the standard jury instruction for inferring intent or mens rea. And it's something that the courts would give in all kinds of criminal cases, maybe even civil cases, when a jury is asked to make a finding regarding a mental state. But the concern that we specifically has, it only references without consent. In other words, it seemingly restricts evidence that might relate to consent and all the surrounding circumstances. And I think to make it balanced, it should say consent or without consent on those three portions that I tried to reference. Many of these cases do come to us he said, she said type thing. There's nothing in the bill that's going to necessarily resolve that. In other words, even if she said no, he's going to claim that she said yes. And that's ultimately up to the fact finder to decide. And I don't mean to say that coarsely or to endorse that. I'm just describing a reality of this type of human conduct. Many times, particularly with young people who just meet, things aren't spoken verbally. These things are incidental. Alcohol is often involved. And I just don't think that having an arm's length contractual type agreement put in statute is really going to capture and accurately provide for that kind of interaction among people. So I'll answer any questions if anyone has any. Senator Slama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Eichel, for being here today. I wanted to get your thoughts. In past legislation that Senator Pansing Brooks has brought towards this end, I would have agreed to you with the objection that you can't have some sort of contractual obligation for consent. It's just not realistic. But where are you seeing that in LB 360? Because I'm not.
That's probably fair. That's actually not in the bill, but I was responding to the proponent testimony.
Okay, well, I think it's important that we stick. I understand that the proponent testimony has taken it in a direction that's not necessarily in the meat of the bill, and I think it's important, especially since Senator Pansing Brooks isn't here, that we stick with what the core of the bill is on paper, not necessarily what the overarching intention might be with the legislation. So
that's a valid point.
So on page 3, line 21, it says the victim need only resist either verbally or physically, whether actively or passively. I'm not sure how you establish resistance passively.
Yeah, and that's another area that we had concern about. I was going to mention that, but thanks for pointing that out. That's true, and so many times you just have two people there in an intimate moment. Things aren't discussed in these situations oftentimes. And maybe they should be, but that's a greater societal thing beyond maybe the criminal code, or certainly this bill.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? I see none. We certainly understand the issue here, which is so often these cases come down to just two people who are alone, and the idea that the person that commits the sexual assault always says, I had consent, right? I mean, that's the defense every time, and the person who is the victim says, I did not consent. In fact, I said no and get out of my apartment, whatever it is. And it just comes down to a belief thing. Who does a fact finder believe? It's a really tough spot to be in for a prosecutor, and a tough spot to be in for a victim.
That's true.
I don't think that changes with the bill, however, unless somebody's recording the whole thing, in which case you got evidence of it. But it's still going to be I didn't say yes versus I said no. I don't know. These are really, really tough cases for prosecutors, I'm confident, and that's why a lot of them never get filed, right? Victims don't want to go through it.
I can't speak for them, but I think that's what I can't speak for the prosecutors. That wouldn't be fair for me to do that.
Well, I certainly understand what the goal of this bill, and I appreciate it too. Any other questions for Spike? Seeing none. Anyone else here to speak in opposition? Anyone here to speak in a neutral capacity? Seeing none. There is no close when the senator is unavailable under these circumstances, but the record before we close the hearing will reflect that we have 7 position letters, 6 are proponent, and 1 is in opposition. We do have 2 submissions this morning by way of written testimony. The first from Michelle Weber, representing the Nebraska County Attorneys Association, and the other, Alina Salisbury, also a proponent speaking on her own behalf. And with that, we will close our hearing on LB 360, and that will end our hearings for the day. Thank you, and we'll see you all back here tomorrow at 9:30.